Hi, folks. My name is Ben Tallman. I am a protocol specialist at Figment, covering the Ethereum ecosystem. For those that are not aware of Figment, we are an institutional non-custodial staking service provider, been around for quite a while, and been on Ethereum pretty close to the launch of Beacon Chain. This is the first in a series of videos I'd like to do that. The aim of these is to help non-technical folks understand a little bit more about Ethereum. So, beginner to kind of intermediate level, heavy focus on the Ethereum specs. So whenever you want to understand anything about Ethereum, it's best to refer to the specs or code, so the implementations of the specs. So that's going to be the focus of these videos. In this first video, I want to intro the specs a little bit. The goal is to keep these videos short, so 5 to 10 minutes, that kind of thing. And then I'll just keep adding topics throughout. So let's take a look at the specs. Let me just share my tab. Here we go. So if we take a look, Ethereum specs, and we'll look at the consensus specs. I focus mainly on the consensus layer. I try to capture everything, of course, but a lot of my time is spent on the consensus layer. So for folks that aren't super aware of the specs, you can think of them basically as blueprints. So, if you look at, let's just go Ethereum client diversity, share this window in a second. Share this tab instead. Here we go. Oh, I should zoom in a little bit as well. Sorry. These are obviously going to be rough videos, as you can tell. Kind of, I guess I'll edit them to some extent, but I'll leave a lot of these errors in. It's mainly meant to be a learning tool. It's not going to be super polished. Anyway, so if you've heard of these clients, for instance, execution clients, Geth, Nethermind, Bezu, Aragon, and then consensus clients, Lighthouse, Prism, Teku, these are the implementations of the specs. So, when we go back to the consensus specs, and again, I'll zoom in just a bit here. The consensus specs will be implemented by the consensus clients, which I just showed. So like Lighthouse, Prism, Teku, etc. Grandine, Lodestar, Nimbus. Try not to leave anyone out here. I think I've got everyone. Lighthouse, Prism, Teku, Nimbus, Lodestar, Grandine. There we go. So actually, before I even get to this, I think if you want to learn Ethereum in detail, especially the consensus layer, the most useful thing you can probably do is read the annotated specs. So here, I'll share this real quick. And I promise we'll get down to the task at hand here, but Ethereum annotated specs. So there are a handful of these. Folks have written these. Basically, annotated specs are just the specifications with notes attached to them, explanations. Vitalik's got some, Danny Ryan's got some, there are others with some. Ben Edgington has some. I just clicked through on Ben Edgington's. In my mind, Ben Edgington is one of the best folks that, explaining how Ethereum works. The annotated specs are a phenomenal tool. I've used them a bunch. That's how I learned a lot about Ethereum. So highly, highly recommend. Some of them are dated. So if you click through to Beacon Chain, you can see this is phase 0. So the initial launch of Beacon Chain, that's what these annotated specs are. But you can go through and you can see in blue all of the notes. Okay. And this is like, there's a lot here. Okay. And my understanding is that Ben Edgington is going to continue to work on his annotated specs and continue to update them. You can see here, Upgrading Ethereum book. You can see this is the landing page, and there are a bunch of, some of the links are not active yet, but there are other links, and you can click through and understand, if you want to know about deposits and withdrawals, for instance, you can get into this. Ben's notes are really phenomenal. There are some other folks as well. Jim McDonald of Attestin is also very good. I haven't followed his content lately. I don't know if he's putting out content, but he's also another great explainer. Lots of folks in the space. If you're looking for them, you can get some very good notes and explanations, videos, etc. But I highly recommend Ben Edgington if you can find stuff by Jim McDonald. Another very good person to follow and to find any articles by him that you can. Anyway, back to the specs. So what you see here are the various hard forks on Ethereum, the upgrades. You might have heard of some of these: Phase Zero, Altair, Bellatrix, Capella, Deneb, Electra. So Electra just happened a handful of weeks ago. You might have heard of it referred to as Pectra. So one of the things that core devs do in terms of naming, there's the execution layer of Ethereum, there's the consensus layer of Ethereum. The upgrades on the execution layer are named after cities. The upgrades on the consensus layer are named after constellations. And what you'll see often is that they're merged together to create a name. So for instance, the latest upgrade on the consensus layer, as you can see, the name is Electra. On the execution layer was Prague, and those two were put together to create the non-existent word Pectra, or it did not exist before the upgrade. So you might have heard of other variants of that, but that's the way it works. Constellations on the consensus layer side and cities on the execution layer side. Another thing to understand about the specs is that aside from Phase Zero, all the other versions are not complete versions. So if you click through on, let's say, Bellatrix on specs, and let's say we want to look at Beacon Chain, everything you're going to see below are things that have changed since changed from a prior upgrade. So it could go all the way back to Phase Zero. It could be from Altair or some other upgrade in between. But what you see listed are just the parameters and functions that have changed. So you don't get the entire specs. The only way to get the entire specs is if we go back and we go to Phase Zero. This creates a bit of a headache for folks that are new to Ethereum, because it's very helpful to have an understanding of the history of Ethereum since the launch of Beacon Chain. What did the various upgrades, what happened with the various upgrades? So if you're just learning and your main goal is just to understand how Ethereum works, I'd recommend, again, starting with the annotated specs. And then when you look at the regular specs, the non-annotated ones, I would start with Phase Zero to understand various pieces. And then what you can do is go through the upgrades and see how those functions, see how those parameters have changed. To kind of help give you a sense of what this looks like, I'm going to start with slashing. I'm going to do a separate video that talks about slashing, especially what slashing looks like today post Pectra and what it looked like pre Pectra, and I'll give a little bit of an explanation as to what slashing is, why it happens on Ethereum, etc. That'll be in a separate follow-up video. But for this one, I just want to show one of the things that happens after a slashable event has occurred, and just to kind of give you a sense of what the specs look like and how to kind of read through them. So I'm going to save what causes a slashing event to happen. That's going to be, again, in the next video. So let's just assume a slashable event has happened, and evidence of that slashable event has been caught, and what happens after that. So there are multiple things that happen. The only thing I want to cover on this video is the initial action, which is there's an initial penalty that's levied. And I want to show you what that looks like, just to give you a sense of how the specs work. And then I'm going to have a bit more to say about how to use the specs. And if you're totally new, a good kind of first step in reading through the specs and understanding how things happen. If all of this seems like a bit too much with the specs, I would recommend reading some intro articles. If you're totally fresh, don't know anything at all about Ethereum, new to crypto, I would start with some more general articles before you get into the specs. So bear that in mind. I'm assuming some sort of prior knowledge. You don't have to have it, but it's likely helpful to understand. So I'm going to click through on Phase Zero, and then we're going to go through all of the upgrades where there have been changes to the initial slashing penalty. And bear in mind, you're going to have to take some of this stuff as read, that I kind of know what I'm looking for, and you won't obviously necessarily have that same benefit. So I'm going to tackle that at the end in terms of how you might figure out where exactly you need to look. So just for now, take it as read. So slash validator, I believe, is the first function we're looking for. There you go, slash validator right here. So we click through. Okay, so here's the function slash validator. This is just the method signature. So it describes the name of the method or function, and then the input parameters or input variables, and then the return type. In this case, nothing is returned. But the function itself still acts on the state of Ethereum, if you like. These quote marks represent a comment. You'll see at least two different kinds. There's this, and there's also the hashtag or pound sign. And this is also a comment. In other words, these are not meant to be interpreted by the program. So you can think of these as just like descriptors of what the function is going to do. They're meant for your benefit, but they're not meant to be interpreted in terms of the function itself. So the first few bits, when a validator is initially slashed, there are a couple things that happen. There are four things ultimately that happen for a slash validator. We're just going to focus on the initial two. First, the validator, the exit process is initiated for the validator. And you can see that's what happens right here. And actually that function, initiate validator exit, is just above right here. And so you can go in and see exactly what happens here. But we're focusing on slash validator, so we're not going to get into that. But just understand that with a lot of these functions or methods, there are nested functions and methods. So sometimes a few levels deep that you have to go to get a full picture of what is actually happening. So the exit process is initiated. Some state level variables are changed. So validator.slashed equals true. So now the protocol has a sense that this validator has been slashed, and the withdrawable epoch is set. And here, decrease balance. This is where the slashing penalty is levied. Now I'm going to ignore this stuff. Again, I'm going to cover that in a separate video. But there are some other things that happen, and when you watch, if you watch the other video, you'll get a full sense and you'll get a better understanding of why these things happen as well. But for now, let's just focus on the first two things that happen. The validator is exited, and they have an initial slashing penalty. So it's this piece I want to draw your attention to. So we already saw initiate validator exit. I'm going to ignore all this for now, as I say. Because I'm going to cover that in a separate video. I want to talk about decreased balance. Okay, this is the interesting part. So there are the two things. The exit process has begun, and the validator receives an initial penalty. Or an initial penalty is levied, I should say. So you can ignore these two things. This is just to identify the state and the validator. But then this is the interesting part. This is the amount that the validator has taken from its balance. So first we have validator.effective balance. So this method returns the validator's balance in GUI. 1 ETH equals 1 billion GUI. So this will likely look for most validators, especially pre-Pectra, this would look like about 32 billion. If you were talking about ETH, it would be 32 ETH. But if it's in GUI, it's 32 billion. Then you have this symbol. And this in Python 3 represents floor division. Floor division is just taking a number, dividing, and dropping the decimal. In other words, you're rounding down to the nearest integer or whole number. That's what this function is doing. Min slashing penalty quotient. Okay, so I don't know why it's not, for some reason it's not really grabbing. That's weird. Okay, so I'm going to copy that and take a quick look. 128. That's what min slashing penalty quotient is. So we go back to the function. So remember, you've effectively got the validator's balance, okay? And you can think of that as 32 billion GUI, or you can think about it as 32 ETH, whatever works for you. And then the min slashing penalty quotient, which is 128. Another way to think about this is that 1/128th of a validator's balance is taken from them. You can think about that however you want. In other words, in terms of the scale of this validator.effective balance. Understand, though, that it actually is important that the amount is in GUI. Because if you represented this in ETH and did 32 floor division 128, the nearest whole integer rounds down to 0. Or sorry, the result of floor division will give you 0. So there would be no initial slash. So you take 32 billion, you divide by 128, and you get 250 million. And so if you want to reflect that as ETH, it would be 0.25 ETH. But if you try to do that with just ETH, you would end up with 0.25. And using floor division, remember, floor division is just dividing a number and throwing the decimals away, or rounding down to the nearest integer In this case, you would round down to 0. You wouldn't have 0.25. That's why it actually is important that you think about this in terms of GUI. So anyway, from a high level, for phase 0, so this is when Beacon Chain first launched at the end of 2020. Slash validator, among all the other things that happen, the first two things that happen, the validator is ejected, or the exit process has begun for the validator. They're going to exit the active set, or they're going to be exited from the active set, and they have the initial slashing penalty applied. So now, knowing this, that was phase 0. Let's go and see what's happened with the subsequent upgrades, because the initial slashing penalty has actually been changed a few times. So let's go back and let's look at Altair. And by the way, just as I guess a bit of trivia, when Beacon Chain was first launched, the idea was that the initial slashing penalty was going to be less than the long-term target for slashing. The thinking here is that for folks that are brave enough, let's say, to help out and launch Ethereum and to be an early validator, the core community thought it would be better to have lesser penalties. In other words, you're not going to get you get a bit of a break on the penalties if you're one of the few that's willing to take the risk to help launch a new network. So that's kind of roughly the thinking. I think, I'm sure the core devs and Ethereum Foundation would have a bit of a different wording of that, but that's basically the idea behind that. So let's go to Altair. So again, we looked at phase 0, and if you remember, it was 1/128th. So now let's see. I believe Altair did change, but let's just double check that. So as a reminder, as I said before, as with phase 0 is an exception, but all other versions of the specs that all of these, let me just go back. Except for phase 0, all of these, Altair, Bellatrix, Capella, Deneb, Electra, all of these copies of the specs contain the changes only. They're not full sets of specs. Okay, so the reason I bring that up is when we look at Altair, all of these things will have changed. Okay, there are actually quite a few changes with Altair. It changed the way rewards and penalties worked. The accounting. Here we go. I'm actually looking at it right now. Also, min slashing penalty quotient Altair. If you remember, phase 0 was 128. With Altair, it's 64. What that means is the penalties actually increased. Because if you remember, we're actually going to go to the updated function. The min slashing penalty quotient Altair, as the name suggests, is the divisor. So in other words, if you divide by a smaller number, you're going to end up with a larger penalty. And you can see that here. Okay, still floor division. This still returns a validator's balance in GUI. So probably 32 billion, around 32 billion. And then you divide through by 64. So we went from a quarter of an ETH. Now it's half an ETH. Okay, because if you think about it, forget about floor division for a second. If you take 32, divide by 64, you have half. Half an ETH is taken away. So we went from a quarter of an ETH to half an ETH with Altair. This does continue though. So Bellatrix, this is the upgrade just before the merge happened. So let's look at that real quick. Here we are. Min slashing penalty quotient Bellatrix, and we've got 32. So I'm not going to go back to the function. The function is the same. It just uses this new parameter. That's 32. So phase 0, the launch of Beacon Chain, 128. In other words, a quarter of an ETH penalty for a 32 ETH balanced validator. 64 in Altair. So half an ETH for a 32 ETH validator. And now with Bellatrix, 32. So 32 divided by 32 is 1 ETH penalty. So you can see how it went from quarter of an ETH, half an ETH to a full ETH with the various upgrades that happened. And this was meant to be the final penalty for the initial slashing penalty. So just before the merge, the final penalty was there at 1 ETH basically. And again, assuming you have a balance of 32 ETH. That said, with Electra that just, as I say, just happened a few weeks ago. If we scroll down, we can see min slashing penalty quotient Electra. It's now 4,096. So 1/4096th of a validator's balance. Now, to be honest, I'm not 100% on the reasoning for this. I believe it has to do with consolidating validators. So one of the options that's open to validators post Pectra, so today, is to consolidate active validators. Now, there's a bunch of stuff involved in that, and I'll put out a video maybe down the line about how exactly what's everything that's involved with that. But one of the things is consolidating validators. The ability to do that improves a few things for Ethereum. So one of the issues for Ethereum is that it has a very large active validator set. Today, it's around, I think, 1,050,000, something like that. But the fact of the matter is there are folks with a large number of active validators, because until Pectra, you had to have 32 ETH minimum and your max effective balance was 32. So if you had a lot more than 32 ETH, you'd have to activate additional validators. Post Pectra today, you can consolidate a bunch of your validators into one. In other words, you can opt into increasing your max effective balance from 32 to 2,048. So in other words, you can deploy a lot more ETH into a single validator. One of the issues was that if the slashing penalty was left the way it was before, that's 1/32nd, there's an increased penalty if you consolidate your validators. If you carry a higher balance, that initial penalty is higher. So I think it's likely that the rationale for this, and if I remember correctly, this actually was part of the rationale. I think I'd read about this, but the idea was that you don't want to inhibit folks from consolidating validators. And so to help the chance along, if you decrease the initial slashing penalty, folks might be more likely to consolidate active validators. So that's why this, at least in my mind, I'd want to double check this. This is actually the rationale, or part of the rationale, I should say. But I believe that was part of the thinking for this reduced penalty. And if you think about it, I mentioned 2,048 ETH is the new max effective balance if you opt into it. You don't have to, but you can opt into it. And 2,048 divided by 4,096 is 0.5. In other words, half an ETH. And if you'll remember, up until Pectra, the penalty was 1/32nd. So if you had 32 ETH, the penalty would be 1 ETH. So post Pectra, if you have the largest validator you could, according to max effective balance, that is a validator with 2,048 ETH, the highest penalty, the highest initial slashing penalty, there are other ones to talk about, the highest initial slashing penalty would be half an ETH for a validator carrying a balance, an effective balance of 2,048 ETH. So that gives you a sense of the specs. I did want to quickly touch on how you can use this, how you could start looking at the specs and learning more about Ethereum. The specs are very helpful if you want to know about specific aspects of Ethereum. So if you want to look up, we looked up slashing. If you want to know more about rewards, how rewards are processed, how penalties are levied, the specs are very helpful. You can also get a general sense of how Ethereum works. Let me just find, epoch processing is very helpful. You can see every epoch, and as a reminder, there are 32 slots, 32 12-second slots in an epoch. Every epoch, there are a bunch of processes that happen to update the state, and you can see that here. Epoch processing, process epoch, and you can see all of these routines. And by the way, this has been updated. There are new functions and processes that happen on an epoch by epoch basis. So it's worth taking a look at this one, for instance. So you can just kind of get a sense, every epoch, that is every 32 slots, Ethereum does a bunch of things to update its state, and that's captured here. And so you can go into each one. You can see process rewards and penalties, for instance, process slashings, process effective balance updates. That's another interesting one. There's something called hysteresis, which has to do with how a validator's effective balance is updated. I'll cover that in another video. So that's epoch processing, there's another one that's also very helpful. Go back. Oops, too far. It's block processing, but I don't see it. So maybe we'll just search for block processing. So this is on a slot. The next one I'm looking up, it's not epoch processing, it's block processing, and blocks happen or have the potential to happen every slot. So if we go, I think it's block. Oh, no, process block maybe. Yes, process block. There we go. So a slot on Ethereum, which is again 12 seconds, is it's not necessarily a block. Think of it as the potential for a block. Sometimes slots are missed for various reasons, but think of each 12-second slot as the potential for a block. So this is block processing. So every time a block is added to the state of Ethereum, these things happen. Okay, and so that's another way for you to go through and kind of get a sense of what happens on a block by block basis and an epoch by epoch basis, which will help give you a sense. So that's it for a very brief intro to the specs. And again, this is for consensus layer. Execution layer is also doing something on the specs, but I believe that's a newer thing. I don't think there have always been execution layer specs. I could be wrong on that, so just you can Google that. But I'm pretty sure that the effort to create execution layer specs is a newer thing. So that's a quick intro to the specs. Just to summarize, highly recommend if you want to learn Ethereum in detail, check out Ben Edgington's annotated specs. Those are fantastic. And as I say, I believe he's going to be doing more work on his Ethereum writings. Very helpful. Jim McDonald, another one to take a look at. There's lots of other ones too, though, like Vitalik has annotated specs. Danny Ryan has annotated specs. All of those are great learning tools. Again, when you're looking at the specs, remember phase 0 is the only full set of specs. All of the other ones related to the upgrades are just what's changed in that particular upgrade. So that's also important to bear in mind. So that's it for this intro video. The next one, as I say, I'm going to cover slashing on Ethereum, what it looks like today and what it looked like just before Pectra. So you can get a sense of what's changed in the last few weeks. Hopefully this has been helpful. And again, especially for that non-technical audience, I do think Ethereum is going to continue to become more and more important, and being able to actually verify things is a skill everyone should have. So anyway, hopefully that helps, and hopefully you'll check out the next video. Cheers.